morning and welcome to the ISAS International Conference on South Asia 2026, Gen Z-led regime change across South Asia. Thank you for joining us online. This conference examines the recent wave of extra-electoral regime changes across the region and the broader structural, political, and social forces driving these movements. Across today's session, we will look at protest dynamics, dissent, and the evolving role of ideology in shaping South Asia's political landscape. To begin, I invite Associate Professor Dr. Iqbal Singh Sevia, Director of the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, to deliver the welcome remarks. Dr. Iqbal, please.
Thank you, Tanuja. Distinguished speakers, colleagues, and participants, friends, and good morning or good evening to all of you, depending on wherever you are joining us from. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the ISAS International Conference 2026, titled Gen Z-led Regime Changes Across South Asia. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this two-day conference organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies, or ISAS, at the National University of Singapore. Over the last few years, South Asia has witnessed a series of dramatic political developments. Since 2022, several countries in the region have experienced extra-electoral regime changes driven by mass public mobilization. In Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal, large-scale protests led to the resignation or removal of sitting political leaders. While the immediate triggers varied, from severe economic hardship and energy shortages to student protests and political grievances, these events point to a deeper structural transformation within South Asian societies. At the heart of many of these movements is a powerful demographic force, the region's youth, a generation deeply connected through digital platforms, increasingly aware of global standards of governance and opportunity, and often frustrated by limited avenues for meaningful political and economic participation. These frustrations have generated new forms of mobilization. At the same time, these developments raise important questions. Are these movements signs of systematic transformation or largely reactive responses to crises? Do they signal the emergence of new political actors and ideas, or do they ultimately reproduce existing structures of powers? And why have similar pressures produced different outcomes across the region? Namely, if we just compare the results of the elections in Nepal and Bangladesh, this leads us to think about some of these questions that I've just highlighted. This conference brings together scholars and practitioners from a wide range of disciplines, including political science, economics, history, sociology, international relations, anthropology, and media studies. And we bring all of you together to explore the questions I've raised and many others that will come up in the discussions that will follow. Across 6 panels over the next 2 days, we will examine how to conceptualize these movements, the deeper drivers of dissent, the role of ideology in anti-corruption politics, and the way in which decentralized and digitally coordinated mobilization is reshaping political participation. We will also consider a critical question. What comes after the uprisings? How have the governments responded, and what prospects exist for translating protest energy into lasting institutional reform? Now, I want to emphasize here that gender will serve as an important cross-cutting theme throughout our discussions, recognizing that the dynamics of protest and political change are deeply shaped by gendered experiences and perspectives. More broadly, these developments bring us to a fundamental issue: the evolving relationship between the state and society in South Asia. The recent uprisings invite us to reflect on the limits of existing political structures and the aspirations of society seeking more responsive, inclusive, and legitimate systems of governance. Our hope is that the conversations over the next 2 days will deepen academic understanding while also generating insights relevant to policymakers and practitioners working across the region. Before I hand the floor over to Associate Professor Ganesh Kudesia, I would like to thank our speakers and chairpersons for their time and contributions, and my colleagues at ISAS for putting this conference together. I'm particularly indebted to Dr. Rajni Gamage, who has taken the lead on organizing this conference. I would also like to thank my colleagues at ISAS, Kanika Kaur, Tanuja Dadlani, and Jordan Ang for getting us all together and putting together such a large conference online. Thank you once again to all of you for joining us. I wish you all a productive and engaging session, and like all of you, I'm looking forward to the discussions ahead. Over to you, Tanuja.
Thank you, Dr. Iqbal. We now move to panel 1, Between Uprising and Revolutions, Reading the New Politics of Protest in South Asia, which focuses on new forms of political mobilization and protest across South Asia. This session is chaired by Associate Professor Gyanesh Kudesia. Our speakers are Professor Sumati Shivamohan, Dr. Naveen Murshid, Dr. Richard Bonas. I invite Professor Gyanesh to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanuja. I'm very pleased to be here in this wonderful conference on such an important theme. This is a kind of a teaser. This session is a kind of a teaser, a kind of a warm-up for the larger themes of the conference, the six other panels which are part of it. And it is on this theme of between uprising and revolutions, reading the new politics of protest in South Asia. So this panel has three distinguished speakers, as Tanuja mentioned, all coming from different parts, focusing on three different countries which we are discussing: Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh. So this panel is focused on the implications of recent protests and social unrest across South Asia, and it seeks to raise a number of important questions. Can the recent youth protest be understood as uprising, traditional revolutions, or expressions of deep-seated anger in society? Do these protests signal possibilities of structural transformation, or are they merely reactive responses to economic and political crisis? Do the mobilizations represent localized struggles, or are they part of a broader global pattern of disillusionment with the political system, leading to expressions of anger? What is the role of populism and political activism? And what kind of revolutionary imagination, if at all, that underpins these protests? How do these protests contest the limits of political system in the global South? So these are all important questions, and I think one of the important question underlying all this is, how do we categorize, historicize these moments in terms of rupture, continuities, or something in between? So with these pointers, these questions, I would like to invite the three speakers, beginning with Professor Sumati Sivamohan, Professor of English in the University of Peradeniya, Sri Lanka, to lead the discussion, and then we will follow the sequence which is listed in the program. You have details of the credentials, the publications, the research profile of each of these speakers, so I would not waste time.
Professor Kudesia, Professor Sumati has requested whether she could go second in the line, so I'm just passing on the message.
Okay, thank you so much. We could then begin with Dr. Naveen Murshid, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Colgate University in the US. May I invite Professor Murshid?
Thank you for this panel. And this is like you, I'm very interested in thinking about the connections across South Asia, that we've seen this slew of what we are calling Gen Z uprisings, right? And I think one of it is important for us to come in to think about what the connections are, if there are any, and what is it all saying to us. Because, I think there is that other prediction that people come up with, at least in a popular sense, that, okay, is India next, right? So is there something structural? Is there some, or even is there some kind of a contagion effect that has an inspiring role, right? That allows the youth to focus in on economic inequality, on their circumstances, the unemployment that's pervasive, right? And in the world today, it's not just South Asia. There's a way in which we are able to recognize the kind of lack of dignity that is part of human existence, right? And that's particularly felt by the youth. And I think what's really interesting is that here is the Gen Z revolution. I think we've been saying this for a long time. I mean, in the last 2 years, that this was supposed to be our apathetic generation, right? They are the ones who are more attached to screens. They're self-centered. They're disrespectful of most things around them. And more importantly, they don't care. And what we've at least realized is that, of course, they do care, right? But I think what we are still unable to recognize is, what that means. What is the language that they speak, right? And so I'll talk about the Bangladeshi experience in a little bit. But I think I want to highlight a few things just in case I don't get to it, because I'm focusing more on the sort of new political language, so to speak, where I'm trying to think about, how things like memes and graffiti and slogans, they all kind of had a coordinating effect, right? That they allowed a certain kind of communication from the streets to enter the political space, not just in terms of communicating to the government, but also communicating to fellow citizens about, here are the demands, here's what we want, are you going to support us, right? And I think that has been critical in building the kind of solidarity that it required for them to successfully bring about this uprising, right? There's a lot of conspiracy theory about, these were the various actors involved, here was outside intervention, blah, blah, blah. But what remains true is that hundreds and thousands of people took to the streets. Hundreds and thousands of people were not coerced into taking to the streets, right? So that part is actually something that has happened. And we recognize that part of it has been the recognition that there is a new kind of politics that has to be contended with, that the status quo isn't working for people. And what state repression did is it basically unleashed all of that, right? And so on the one hand, there is this, like you were saying, Ganesh, that there's this reactive stance, right? That in the face of state repression, a whole number of people took to the streets to fight that. And, what's the long-term consequence of that? Ideologically, politically, are they able to sustain whatever it was, right? Just opposing state repression might not be enough in the long term in terms of structural reforms, in terms of democratic rebuilding, and so on and so forth, right? And then the other part actually was this context highlighted the fact that the country has been going through a almost linear process of democratic backsliding, right? And so state repression, so it wasn't just state repression, it symbolized the lack of democratic structure, the lack of people's agency, the fear that people had come to accept, in terms of speaking openly, in terms of having these kinds of basic rights, right? Particularly of speech, and so I think that's the juncture that's useful to sort of think about the connection between the reactive and the more sort of lasting change that could be possible, right? And I think it's a continuum. It's not a dichotomy, right? It's a continuum through which we can think about how we move from this sort of reactive sense, or a reactive moment, to a moment that actually holds state structures and institutions accountable, right? So I think that in a post-uprising situation, that's where we are now. These are specifically the kind of challenges that we are recognizing, because now, as we contend with this new political language of the youth, I think we are also having to interpret them, because in many instances those are not the language that we're used to. And in many instances, they use the vocabulary that we have, except they mean it in a different way, right? And so in that sense, it has been a challenge to think about, okay, so what do you really mean? So even on questions that are very important, like inclusivity, right? The language of inclusivity that characterized the uprising, something that I think really energized people. What does that actually mean, right? And I think it's based on these kinds of uncertainties that we can then think about the limits, right? I think, something that I think we need to contend with again, Ganesh, picking up on what you were saying, that, what comes in the after, right? What are the challenges now, right? So it's one thing to topple repressive governments, but how do you not make the same mistakes? How do you move forward, especially, let's say, in this context, or in the Bangladeshi context, where you have 15 years of autocratic rule, not consistent autocratic rule. And it didn't actually start out as an autocratic rule. It had a lot of support from people that, but a regime that increasingly became autocratic and so disconnected from people that it failed to even read the room. I mean, the blunders of the Army League regime right before it left, it was very surprising. It spoke to how disconnected they had become, right? And so, but what does that do to the psyche of its population, right? What does it do to the psyche of its youth, right? And here we have the Gen Z population, and in the last 15 years, they grew up in the last 15 years. They have not seen a world where democratic rights exist. They don't know what it actually means to be democratic, right? And so I think that has become, in the aftermath, a really important question, because you replicate what you know, you do what you know. The fact that they don't know what democracy really means has become a significant challenge, and I think that in part is part of the question about, why is it that we don't understand the language that they use. I think part of it is because, in the last 15 years, they've become words that have been used strategically by the state to mean not things like inclusivity or multiculturalism and so on, but to mean a very particular kind of inclusivity that only includes themselves and not anybody else, a very exclusive kind of inclusivity, actually, right? And so that is the baggage that these students and student leaders and new political parties that are now coming up, or platforms that are coming up, that's the baggage that they carry, right? And so I think, I say to say that, there's this way in which we can be hopeful about a youth that is more cognizant of the world around them, has learned that they can hold the state accountable, right? That they are willing to fight for democratic rights, but the limitation is that they might not actually know what that democratic rights entail. There is a need for that kind of political education. And again, it has to be something that is endogenous. You can't just impose these things from the top, right? And we of course, we can just look at the literature on democracy to know that imposed democracies are really not the mode to follow, right? I don't want to go too much, I want to get into the section that I actually wanted to focus on. Ganesh, could you give me a sense of how much time I have? Or I'll just move ahead. Right. So what I wanted to talk about today is really about how cartoons, memes, and graffiti during the July movement had created a way in which these what we can call new language, these language became synchronous with more traditional forms of protest language, right? Such as more traditional writings on the wall and slogans that take more time. So basically the difference between quickly written text and the more kind of traditional, okay, here are the tried and tested slogans that we're using, right? And so what I want to suggest is that it's this synchronousness that allowed more sustained and well-informed movement that allowed everyone to be on the same page. It allowed communication across all kinds of platforms, online, but more importantly, offline, and ensured that everyone could participate. Okay? And so what this allowed was that everyone would know what the issues were, what the demands were, what the people wanted. And I think of particular importance was this period of the internet outage, right? About a week when there was no internet. And I think this was done because of this assumption, right? That the Gen Z is putting out this anti-government protest that's entirely based on social media. So you get rid of the internet, this will fall down. But I think it's in this period, I guess the crucial moment where these things get tested, that the walls, the literal walls became almost the tablets and the devices through which the students could communicate with the population, right? And so it was very interesting to sort of see that, they're using similar kinds of memes that we'd see on social media that basically got replicated on actual walls on the streets. And right, so since they were using memes and social media for communication, when they started appearing on walls, that kind of replaced that sort of social media. The absence of social media during the internet outage. Right? And I think I want to say a few things about the politics of it all, in part because there's a difference, or there was a difference at the time, between the graffiti that the students put up on the walls during the movement and then the ones that we saw right after Sheikh Hasina fled and there was a sort of new political moment, right? Because just the next day, as some students mobilized to help manage traffic. You might remember that after Sheikh Hasina left, there was no police force. There's none of the political institutions were really operating, except somehow everyone had electricity, so some clearly were. But there were no police, there were no traffic management, and so on. And so a whole number of students mobilized to help manage traffic. So they basically became traffic guards. Right? But there were others who went on to a cleaning spree, that they were going to clean up the area. Right? And so the parliament area, critical buildings, and so on. They were cleaning up. Very nice. People were very happy. Oh, look what a post uprising period can look like, where people are very into looking after their country, and they're just playing this very important role as good citizens and so on, right? And so that's been the major kind of focus. But then the walls were also getting cleaned, quote unquote, right? And in part, what they were doing is that they were erasing the original, often vulgar, of course, writing on the wall with beautiful artwork that symbolized various things such as inclusion and democracy and peace and justice and social justice and so on. So they were kind of replacing that. And so what we are calling graffiti now also was actually not graffiti, right? Graffiti defined as the text or art that you produce in the moment in opposition to say state repression, because these are not that anymore. That these are wall art rather, right? And so this in the sense that we were not seeing spontaneous graffiti anymore, but rather political art to create a certain sanitized narrative of the July movement, right? Shaping and reinforcing the certain kind of nationalist narratives that they thought would be useful in the post-uprising period, right? And what was also interesting and also disappointing is that these were actually funded by various NGOs, and without fail, they, in the way that NGOs often do, they kind of moved forward with symbols of shared values and symbols that spoke to strong nationalist emotions, in order to forge, say, a collective identity for which the July martyrs apparently gave their lives. And so, recurrent in this new kind of political art was, how much debt we owed to the July martyrs, and how much we needed to come together collectively to pay tribute. Yeah? And then I guess not such a surprise in retrospect. We saw Dr. Yunus, who had taken charge of the government in the interim period. He went on a world tour with a book of cartoons, right? And again, it became clear that there was significant funding coming in from NGOs, corporations, even international organizations to support this kind of artwork and cartoons and so on, in order to kind of say that, okay, here's an uprising that came about through the use of cartoons. And so there was this international exhibition of graffiti and cartoons of the time, except that, they weren't really distinguishing between the pre-August 5 and the post-August 5 graffiti or cartoons that emerged, right? And so the critical question became, of course, that, who was it that was again trying to tell people what the correct history was, what had happened, and what was actually this writing on the wall telling us, right? So that became critical because we began to realize that right from the get-go, this was up for co-option, right? Right from the get-go, there were people who were telling us, here is what happened, not that a narrative was being created with all this writing on the wall, that here's a very particular way in which the July movement happened. And again, I think this was really an interesting moment, because they then drew parallels to what was happening, drew parallels to the 1971 war of Bangladesh's liberation. And in this moment, there was that parallel, right? That there were this desire to write in already what has happened, right? That here are these students who, with progressive politics, who wanted to really change the world. And here are the various actors, right? So during the movement, we actually didn't know who the actors were, because they wanted to say that this was a leaderless movement. And yet, in the post-uprising movement, there were these slew of actors who emerged as the leaders of the July movement, right? And so as we kind of try to make sense of what it is that this language put forward, I think we have to, I mean, and I don't have a lot of time, so I'll just say two things to conclude as important things to mark out are two kinds of changes that happened in the language. One, misogynist language that entered the political space, that in the 18-month period of the interim government, we've seen incredible rise in misogyny on the streets as well as on social media, directed towards women in public spaces. The other thing that we saw is the rise of religious language, and these things are not exclusive, right? It appeared that a right-wing movement had emerged to co-opt the July movement, and their language was the more religious, and somehow misogyny became part of that religious expression, as if religious expression would necessitate this kind of misogyny, right? So again, as we sort of look to the afterward, I think that becomes important to point out, because that, again, the sort of negative experience from that would then mean people would want to say that things were actually fine during Hasina's regime. At least we could walk out on the streets and not get bodily shamed and so on, right? And so now that there's the BNP government in power, maybe there is that kind of a shift happening again, right? That the positive effects of the movement are getting curtailed by the kind of negativity and sort of undoing all of it. So I think that's the sort of.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Sorry that I went over time a little bit. Sorry.
That's a great start to the conference and to this panel. And we'll come back to you, Naveen, later on. And may I invite Professor Sumati Sivamohan now to make her presentation.
Yes, here I am. Yes, thank you very much. So my paper is on Sri Lanka, and listening to the previous speaker, there was so much, there were so many similarities. There was so much I was like kind of gathering from her thoughts into, as insights to what I'm going to say, although I have a prepared paper, of course. The idea of Gen Z as a Gen Z-led regime changes is what I think we're all going to think about, ruminate on, and also problematize, as she did quite well. Sri Lanka's case of the 2022 uprising is was one of the first, I think, in the South Asian region of of the last the rebellions, uprisings of the last 5-6 years, and in that sense, it was also a little different. I do not know whether we can call it purely a Gen Z-led regime change. It has those markings of a youth of organizing through social media. That I think was the most marked aspect of it in terms of a Gen Z led regime change. But I will also see how we can look upon it as a theoretical form, as a theoretical insight into what I'm going to say. So, living in a time of crisis, state authority, and struggle, the largest popular struggle of post-colonial Sri Lanka. I mean, can you believe it? The largest popular struggle is not the largest, it's not the most impactful struggle. But it was like kind of a largest across the board, kind of momentary, but it was 3 months struggle asking for a change in the government. And that is called the struggle, the Aragalia. And so I'm going to I'm going to look at Gramsci and the idea of the national popular and how you organize around a popular demand where lots of different kinds of people come together, which he calls, so it's cutting across classes. It cuts, in the traditional Marxist way of thinking, it cuts across classes, and it is a moment in the history of a country, or of a community, of a people, and a nation. He calls it the national popular. How do you win that kind of consensus? I think Gramsci probably would have thought of a larger, longer moment, but here it is the constellation of a longer movement or longer period, a long durée, but it was a moment of 3 months, roughly speaking. 3 months is never 3 months, So it's a people, it's actually the longue durée. When I talk of the longue durée, it was also about a people in the making, a dynamic, activist, concentric formation. So for Gramsci, the nation is the terrain, the capture of its socio-cultural, political spaces is the direction in which counter-hegemonic action needs to take place. And, in the civil society. So civil society is also the cultural entity in the ideological. It's where ideological kind of consent building, persuasion takes place. And following Gramsci, we have Stuart Hall, who really, who takes this idea further into the idea of conjuncture, that articulation. There's a moment in which they all come together as protest, as a saying, as an utterance. I mean, the memes, it's the just walking, just the talk, that 2 million people talk together becomes that moment of change. So I have a kind of an elaborate theoretical position here. Maybe I won't have time to go into that. The title of the conference is Gen Z, actively invoking a category of youth. Given in purely middle class and urban terms, and within a particularly 21st century slice of history. So I mean, when we say Gen Z, I mean, we have had insurgencies. We have had very dark periods in which there had been armed struggles against the state. The first major one, there had been flirtations with coups and all, which never, given that the army was very weak then, coups never went anywhere, or other, so it was mostly kind of parliamentary democratic acts that were kind of seen as, votes for change or actual demands for change. But in 1971, we had the youth insurgency. It was called the youth insurgency, but it was youth insurgency, we don't know, but that's the terminology given. But it was a southern Sinhala, the majority community Sinhala dominant youth of a certain class, the peasant and the lower middle class, that came together to shake the government at time with armed, Maoist-led, Maoist-inspired violent insurrection, which was then very, very violently crushed by the state at that time, Ms. Bandanak's government in the 1971. So it's always called the 1971 insurrection. We didn't have an idea, although it was subsequently, I think, called youth. That wasn't the kind of hallmark of it. But the same but it was a party-led. Although there were also other rebellions around that time. Other Marxist-led groups also had kind of similar actions against the government around the same time. We have the long Tamil militant struggle, armed struggle against the state. Starting the militant struggle starts around 1975, through guerrilla activities, guerrilla actions, kind of builds momentum. Then there is the 1983 anti-Tamil pogrom. In 1983, I mean, I don't know how many, it made a decisive change in the nature, brought about a decisive change in the nature of the struggle, and then it became like almost like pitched battle, and continued for another 20 years or something like that. So 25 to 30 years, there was the armed struggle, the militancy, there was the war. and the war was with the Tamil militants. Again, you can say it to some, degree of truth, truth or what authenticity, that it was youth led. It was a youth led movement, though. As I said, it had this national popular or a popular support of the Tamil people to some extent, to some degree. I mean, it was a very repressive moment also, the Tamil militant struggle, particularly the LTT, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, that you may have thought was quite repressive, but it had it cashed in on the grievances of the Tamil people. So that was also youth-led. But here we have the Gen Z community. So, I mean, I was trying to figure out what it means to kind of call this Gen Z. Or it's a new term. It's kind of, and not those. And we don't call them too much as youth. I mean, we don't call them particularly the Tamil struggle. It's not called the youth-led struggle for some reason. And I think it has to have, I mean, I'm trying to think of like why. One is, of course, the modality. The other is it's seen as urban. When I say urban, I don't mean just Colombo. And I don't mean only, I don't think it's like, some upper middle class youth. Although there are elements of it. It's also semi-urban, rural, but it's a particular kind of understood as, people who are using the phones and people who are somewhat deracinated from the community, people who are at a loose end, and people who are frustrated about, the opportunities that are, and the consumer, and the opportunities offered by a consumer kind of world, a neoliberal world that cannot be actually, and where their aspirations cannot be realized. But it's not about consumerism, but it's also about, the proliferation of seeming opportunities, but proliferation of degrees and certificates and identities, very, a diffusion of where the youth may find themselves, or the generation that kind of looks toward the future and looks toward their elders and see that they have failed. So, but unlike so that is one. Thirdly, so I kind of see that it was always, so I'll kind of mark it as this, that it was always a youth-led. I mean, many of these major uprisings in Sri Lanka had been largely youth-led, although we did not call them youth-led. Secondly, it's about the frustrations and the aspirations of a particular kind of youth that had come into being in the 21st century, or the late 20th, 21st century, early 20th centuries. Thirdly, it's also a way of a certain kind of maybe class politics, a politics of that can be associated with structurality, structurality. It had been evacuated from our language. So in the last uprising, in the Aragalaya uprising, which was called the Aragalaya struggle, it literally meant in Sinhala struggle, the struggle, there was a coming together of many forces. Some were very political in the kind of a traditional kind of way, and others not so much, but the corruption, anti-corruption slogan kind of took hold. That is what took hold of the imagination of the people. And
sorry to interrupt, may I invite Sumati to conclude in the next 1 or 2 minutes?
Oh, it's already 15 minutes?
It's more than that, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. We'll have you later on, but it may help just to have
right.
the
Okay.
Yeah,
Sure.
thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So that I will conclude. So that is what has kind of so these three things have to be held together. Now I'm a bit kind of off kilter. So we had a regime change after the Aragal era, although it was crushed violently. But we don't see a sea change in the analytic frame of our thinking. I'm like trying to put words together now, but that's okay. And what I want to mark here is also before this kind of became this very popular struggle, this mass, like 2 million people who gathered for and the last day when on the last day when of the struggle, when the president was made to flee, he fled of fear, because 2 million people, and many of us were there, had gathered on the last day. It was such an uproar. I mean, more heartwarming moment. But on the back of behind all of it, there were the other peripheral moments. Long, when I say moments, struggles of the women against microfinance credit, of the farmers against fertilizer ban. These were peripheral, of the mothers of the disappeared in the north, Tamil mothers, of Muslims, of Catholics. I mean, some of this were spilled over into this. But somehow this also, I'm rushing, I'm simplifying, some of the Aragali also then erased some of the traces of those struggles. And one of the reasons we are still battling, the IMF, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, neoliberalism, are all part of, that erasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We will come back to this theme later on.
I did quite so.
Yeah, thank you so much. May I invite Professor Richard Bonas to make a presentation?
Hello. Yeah, so I do have a PowerPoint to share. Can I try and share that with you? So let me see. Is that visible to people?
Yes,
it is visible.
It is. Okay, just confirming. And yeah, okay. So my talk is entitled What is Democratic About Nepali Democracy, the Gen Z Protests, and the Mismatch of Measurement and Reality in Nepal. And the motivation behind this presentation is a dissatisfaction with the way political science, mainstream political science, measures democracy, and how the underlying causes of the Gen Z protests in September 2025 in Nepal illustrate this problem. So my key points are firstly that the best measures of democracy in Nepal failed badly to capture dissatisfaction with Nepal's democracy leading up to the protests. Secondly, that these measures are probably poor indicators of things that matter to people in many parts of the world, and certainly in Nepal. They don't measure the qualitative democraticness of decision-making at the local level or within political parties themselves, and they don't measure aspirations for good governance. Thirdly, the success of Nepal's new government should be measured by attending to the micro level. That is to say, whether there is actually a decline in the undemocratic particization of organizations and institutions that have affected negatively people's everyday lives in Nepal. So given the time constraints, I won't go into great detail of the VDEM democracy scores. These are the most prestigious scores given to democracies around the world in political science, the ones that are supposedly most based on scientific, social scientific research. I will gesture you towards these scores, which appear in the slide, and you can see scores from 1980 to 2024 for the 5 main subgroups, which the VDEM group looks at, which is deliberative democracy, electoral democracy, participatory democracy, egalitarian democracy, and liberal democracy. And each of those contains dozens and dozens of sub-measures. So I will leave aside the fact that these categories are almost certainly contradictory, but I should note that the scores for each subgroup point mainly upwards over that time period, with notable setbacks just for the civil war period in Nepal and for the royal auto coup. So those were 2 setbacks, but basically we see a kind of positive picture moving forwards. So it seems these scores, if these scores were in any way indicative of the actual reality of people's lives in Nepal, why did the Gen Z protests happen? Why were people protesting against a supposedly improving, or we could say consolidating, democracy? So I would recommend, and I'm drawing to some extent on this excellent new book with Oxford from Herman Kapellen called The Concept of Democracy, which is a kind of deconstruction of pseudoscientific measures of democracy and pseudoscientific ideas about democracy. I believe Nepal is a very good case study for his theoretical and philosophical work. So the grassroots reality of democracy in Nepal, which I could term crudely particization, refers to a relatively stable system of collusive competition between political parties, the aim of which is to secure rent-seeking opportunities, gatekeeping opportunities, positions of influence in the economy, bureaucracy, and society. In Nepal, this is referred to as bagbanda, the division of spoils, or setting, the process of collusion which happens behind closed doors. Obviously parties are not serving the function imagined by Samuel Huntington in his ideal, typical liberal democracy, mediating between society and government, but parties instead have become entities in their own right, effectively cartels that are not pursuing the public good, but their own private organizational goods. So there isn't time to delve into all of the empirical details of this phenomenon, but multiple sectors in Nepal provide examples of this particization, including K-12 education, higher education, local user management committees, such as, for example, forestry user committees, NGOs, hospital management committees, the tourism industry, the construction industry, etc. In all of these sectors, brokers, political brokers, create symbiotic linkages between an industry or a sector and party political leadership, providing services and jobs to political parties in return for protection from competition in the market, or, protection from having to do what they're supposed to do in the field of governance. The system of student wings and the system of contractors are good examples of this particized system. So I got a rather detailed slide there, but basically in the case of student wings, unions hold great influence over everyday functions of higher education, often troublingly so. And in the latter case, so we don't have time to go over that whole slide, but in the latter case, the system of contractors, contractors for roads and infrastructure projects become symbiotically fused with political parties, providing campaign finance in Nepal's extremely expensive electoral campaigns. So the consequences of this are almost entirely negative, and I've summarized some of them on this slide. It creates a 2-tier economy. It undermines internal party democracy by redirecting energies towards creating crony linkages. It discourages innovation, investment, scaling up of business activity. It distorts the economy and development towards activities that can be easily particized, for example, road construction, and away from perhaps more fundamental human development. It advantages upper caste and class sectors who can access these protected sectors and who can act as brokers. And of course, it encourages neo-patronage relationships between party bosses and the party base. So all of this is pretty well known amongst those who live in Nepal. A very crude way of sort of illustrating it is through this diagram. There is a kind of particized middle sector made up of many of the institutions and organizations that people rely on for their everyday life: universities, schools, transport syndicates, NGOs, management committees, etc. And then at the bottom, you have small-scale tea shops, bike repair shops, which are not really interesting to the parties because they don't provide enough profit. And then you have perhaps a smaller sector at the very top, high-tech, maybe arguably some sectors of international capital, well, arguably, which kind of evade control or brokerage through the particized system. So what is the use of this? Well, okay, so I should just say something else. So relating this to the Gen Z protests, I think this was exemplified by their attack on Nepo babies, so-called Nepo babies. So these were privileged actors who were supposedly tied to political party leaders and seen as having opportunities because of those political connections, which most of the Gen Z protesters themselves didn't have. So this hampering of economic and labor development, which Gen Z protested, is intimately tied to Nepal's particized political economy. So I would say beyond some of the more superficial issues which Gen Z were protesting, the shutting down of the internet, what they were really protesting was this system, this particized system. And that was, in fact, directly tied to the shutting down of the internet, which happened just before the protests, because the government didn't want people to expose instances of this kind of party-led corruption. And that is why social media was shut down just before the protests happened. So going forwards, my argument is that there is a need for more grassroots political sociology and less fine-tuning of systems of democracy measurement in political science, which are very prestigious, which I believe are fundamentally flawed. And I think Nepal illustrates why they are fundamentally flawed. So if we're trying to assess the question of whether the new RSP government will change this system of particization or just the party leading it, I think we need regular visits to local locations. I think we need to ask about ongoing party involvement in those sectors which I mentioned: school management, forestry management, hospital management, migrant recruitment agencies, tourism companies, NGOs, etc. Gen Z aspirations will have been met by the new government if these interactions and local institutions become less particized over time. And these are things which which political science measures of democratic consolidation are completely inadequate at measuring of present. For a version of some of what I'm saying, or something which is complementary to what I'm saying, I would recommend people to look at Sumana Shrestha's YouTube talk, The Nepali Dream. Sumana Shrestha was an idealistic Nepali politician who became education minister and later had to resign. And her YouTube talk, The Nepali Dream, I think covers some of what I'm getting at here. Okay, well, that's all I have to say. I think I might have finished within the time. So
thank you.
I will be ready to answer questions at any point. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we've had 3 wonderful presentations, and what I could do is to really open up the floor for questions. But before I do that, may I just take the privilege of being the chair to ask 1 or 2 questions. So, and this is to all 3 of the participants, speaking about Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh. So the first question is really about the centricity of these. Where were these protests centered? Were they really capital centric? Mainly using Colombo, Dhaka, and Kathmandu as a locus, or were they really widespread in? That's one question. The second is the gender dimension. Were these really how participatory they were in terms of the participation of Gen Z women, students, girls, and not just in terms of being faces in the crowd, but in terms of the planning, the logistics in deciding the next steps. That's another question. And thirdly, Naveen mentioned this very important point about inclusivity. This idea of inclusivity. So is the inclusivity also representing, for example, the Madesi people in Nepal? Is it representing the Tamils and the Muslims in the case of Sri Lanka? Is it representing the Biharis and the Hindus and the Buddhist minorities? Yeah. So do the Gen Z protests and these uprisings are inclusive in that sense? Thank you. Any one of you could respond. Yeah.
I don't mind responding. Is that okay?
Yes,
First,
perfectly okay. Yes, perfectly.
because so that I wouldn't forget.
Yes.
Yeah. So yes, it was. The short answer is it was in Colombo, right in the heartland of the commercial kind of center. This is the esplanade facing the sea, the recreational kind of place. And Gotabaya, the president, was kind of, he had a suite in one of those new high-rise the hotels that had come up. He had shares in it, so the protest kind of convert. So it was very much a Colombo thing. Having said that, there were also the people came from outside daily, and in the last few days, more and more. Even when there was a strike, I mean, some strike came up, engineered by the government, and then there were all kinds of impediments set up. But the people, kind of braved all that. I mean, the train. The engine drivers said that they would run the trains and all. So there was a mass of people. And there were also, in peripheral areas, there were other Aragalia points established. But as I also said before, there were also, these protests were preceded by, other local protests that were more specific. They were kind of specific about their interests. The farmers' protests, the women's protest against microcredit, which was quite stark, and the Tamil women's protest about disappeared children, which was ongoing, which was long. Then, about inclusivity, women had a huge role to play. That's the kind of a short and long answer. Whether there was no misogyny, that I wouldn't say no at all. There was a left wing, the radical left, and the right wing converging in that protest area. There were different, this was kind of very diffuse. All of that I couldn't go into. But yeah, I mean, the Aragalia came in the wake of a wave of anti-Muslim actions, by the right wing. So when the Aragalia came, and it was partly fueled by the state's, the government's policies and actions, particularly, and it was connected to Easter bombings of Easter Sunday bombings of 2019. And so Muslims took part in it in a big way. Also Catholics. The Tamils were there, the Tamils of Colombo, But
Sure.
at the same time, I must say, there was also some resistance to it in the north of Sri Lanka by the Tamils saying, this is a Sinhala demand. I mean, we had been fighting for so long. So, okay,
Thank you. Let's hear the view from Kathmandu and Nepal and Dhaka. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Well, if I speak first, I mean, perhaps unlike some of the other presenters, I wasn't in Nepal when the protests happened. I'll be back in June and July, and I have a research project actually, which is designed to speak to your questions. So I can't anticipate the findings. I'm planning to speak to protesters in the central state in Kathmandu and also in the Terai in Chitwan.
Sure.
So I'm hoping to get a sense of whether these central and peripheral protests were qualitatively different in certain ways, but I can't really speak to it at the moment. I mean, if you read the secondary sources and the journalism, there's a sense that that elite and very male networks took over these Gen Z protests quite rapidly. So that might be part of the story, that elite network capture of what was originally a spontaneous movement. But I really don't want to anticipate what I'm going to try and research this summer. But I mean, those are obviously very important questions.
Perhaps Rajini might organize a post fieldwork talk by you to help update all of you. What you said about political sociology, importance of political sociology, is hugely important. And I think you are spot on in saying that political science models have limits in explaining what happened in Nepal. Naveen, would you like to respond to? Yeah.
I think, this was really interesting in the sense that, Bangladesh had seen several uprisings in the past, and they were primarily located in the Dhaka University area, in Dhaka, a particular area in Dhaka, not just Dhaka, a particular area in Dhaka. Right? And so like that, this started there too. So Dhaka University is that site of conscious students who
historically it has been.
Yes, absolutely right.
Yeah.
So what was interesting here is that it spread throughout Dhaka and then outside. But I think, in thinking about the location aspect, part of it is also, that reactive moment, right? That protests emerge where there's repression, right? And I think so what was interesting is that the state attacked students not only in Dhaka University, but they also attacked different parts of the city, right? And gatherings where there were private universities. Private universities are not in the same area as the Dhaka University. They're like, in different parts, right? And so in so doing, the state unwittingly spread the protest, right? So the state repression became visible no matter where you were. You couldn't turn your eyes away, right? It's not a Dhaka University specific issue. It's there were children who got shot by bullets, like stray bullets, right? And so you couldn't really miss it, right? And so I think that really brought the protest home for everyone, that it made it everyone's issue, right? But then it's not, again, only in Dhaka either, because the mobilizing force, you will remember this image of this young man with his arms spread out, Abu Saeed, who, I think that was iconic in the sense that it really represented the degree to which the state was willing to just use force even without threats, because he was unarmed. He had his arms spread, as to say that, okay, fine, shoot me. But in that expression, and that's the video that went viral, right? In that video, you can see that he didn't think that he was going to get shot. He was like, okay, come shoot me. He's like, of course you're not going to shoot me, but here, shoot me. And then, the surprise in his face when he actually does get shot, right? And I think that really moved the people around, because, as he just fell down, that expression on his face of shock that, how could you do this? I think that was really mobilizing. This happened in North Bangladesh, in a place called Rangpur, right? Very far from the city, right?
Yeah.
And so in that way, so it became, again, I think, if you sort of think about a mass uprising in a real sense, that's what it was, right? So as opposed to a very Dhaka-centric, Dhaka University-centric protest, this became nationwide protest, right? So it became, we can even sort of think about it in a two-tier way, right? Because, I was sort of thinking about Sumati's description of these very specific issue-oriented protests, right? Because here it wasn't issue-specific; it was a sort of the first tier was an anti-repression movement, and then within, couched under that, you could sort of think about second-order issues, right? Where some of these issues were true, because if you were to read the writings on the wall, there were writings that said that will your bullets feed us, right? We don't need we need jobs, not bombs, that kind of a thing. And so these issues were out there, but in an overall sense, it was an anti-repression movement. In terms of gender and inclusivity, I think the protests themselves were very women heavy, right? Women were at the forefront. I mean, I was able to visit these protest sites, participate in these protest sites. There's a University Teachers Coalition that I sort of liaised with while there. And that gave me the opportunity to see how frontal women leaders were, whether they were professors or whether they were students, right? And so that was a significant movement, especially when you saw these protests running in late into the night. These are all-night protests that people never went back home. They were just out on the streets for days in, days out, men, women, children, everyone, right? And so in that sense, there was a sense that, this is almost like a festival, right? These are all out there in these, more traditional Dhaka University. There's this sort of sense that this was more like a festival, and women did not feel unsafe at all. The times that I had been there, neither did I. I mean, there were people that I didn't know, but not for a second, even if it was at 2 a.m., not for a second did I think that, something's going to happen to me, right? And I think that's something that changed as the protests died down and you saw a regime change, and then the misogyny that emerged that I was telling you about, right? And in part, that may have been a response to the women-heavy protest, right? That, seeing women out in the open for so long, you kind of have this reaction on the other side too. So in terms of inclusivity, you did see that, I don't know, maybe the Biharis weren't really included, but the protests themselves were very inclusive, across class, across minority groups, across cultures.
Thank you so much. We have a number of questions which are in the chat box, and I would like to turn to those ones in a sequence. They come in a sequence. The first one is not addressed to anybody. So can I read two questions at a time? So the first one, Mr. Anand Kumar, does the Gen Z-led July movement signal a shift from ideology-based politics to networked issue-based mobilization? And is this transformation sustainable beyond protest movements? So that's the first question. And the second question comes from my colleague, Dr. Lidarev, who would like to know, whose comment is this: most revolutions tend to be youth-led, often led by unhappy young men. How are the Gen Z protesters different from youth-led movements protest in South Asia's recent past? So these are not addressed to anybody, and any one of you could answer them. And then I have many more down the line, and I would read those. So could we please have a response to these two questions? Yeah. Who would like to
Okay,
respond?
I'll go.
Yeah,
I'll go.
of course.
Right. Okay.
Yes, please
So
go
kind
ahead.
of,
Yes.
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 So actually, the Aragalia, in 2022, Sri Lanka was not particularly issue-based. There were issues that kind of the shortages that brought people together, but it became a very diffused. large, organism. There was the Aragalia Parliament, there was the Aragalia Library, there was the Aragalia University, all in tents, and then lots of the gay community, LGBTIQA community was very much there. And as I said, the Catholic community was there, out there in full force. You could kind of visibly see.
Sure.
So it was an anti-government movement and
Sure.
anti-corruption. Maybe if you say issue-based, maybe corruption became a slogan, and go Gota home. Gota is the shortened, yeah.
Sure.
And the other, so it was, whether it's ideology, yes, that is a concern, that's an important thing.
Right.
Because the left was, or the radical left was there. It was one of the spearheaders.
Sure.
They spearheaded also. They were youth, but also they are still there.
Sure.
So I would say for a mass movement to take hold, kind of come together like this, it can't be too much kind of bogged down in a particular ideological position. It won't capture the imagination of the people. But the radical left is continuing to fight. And there were now the other issues are coming. The anti Prevention of Terrorism Act, and then the microcredit is still there, and all of that. So that is so that's a kind of a short and long answer.
Thank you.
The other is whether it's always youth-led.
That you answered earlier, actually. You said that they have always been.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll give it.
Yeah. Let's hear from Naveen. Yeah.
I don't think there's a difference between ideology, that we see a difference, that we haven't moved away from ideology to a more network-based. I feel the network-based aspect of these movements is really strategic, right? It's in order to enhance whatever the other issues are, and because it's very ideological, right? The anti-Hasina movement, I think the parallel to Go Gota Go was Step Down Hasina, right? And, it's very, very ideological, and I think that became only more clear in the days that came forward, that it was really about democratic rights, that it is about a certain kind of inclusive politics that had become, that had been eroding for a very, very long time. So there's that aspect. And in terms of the youth, I think it's a very provocative question, because how is it that we define the Gen Z, right? I think what we've done effectively is said that, okay, here's, we will call this the Gen Z, right? I think there's a little bit of ascribing that's happening here. In part, I think there's even a calculation, right? When this was happening on the ground, and those of us who are trying to make sense of it, I remember thinking that, okay, a Gen Z label is actually useful to bring international attention because it draws these connections to other mobilizations. So there is a specific element there too, that we have we haven't actually separated these two things. We've actually ascribed a new descriptor to a youth population that already existed, and and whether the gender aspect, I think that's a variable aspect. It changes through different mobilizations, but I think the Gen Z in particular, I think, is a way to characterize the youth of this time as opposed to a sort of timeless youth.
Sure. Thank you so much. Richard, over to you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, which question would you like me to address? I noticed.
Well, I think very briefly, both, if you could respond. Is it ideology, which is driving
on ideology? Well,
issues? Yeah.
Yes, I don't think the protests were very ideological in the left-right sense. I think in Nepal, the Maoist Party has done a great deal to de-ideologize people in a sort of a rather disillusioning way over the last 10 to 15 years, since that party has been so centrally involved in party-based corruption. So especially amongst Gen Z, there is a sort of active anti-ideology, which I suppose we could say is a kind of ideology. So no, as of now, I can't think of anything.
And I mean, the other question about whether it's youth always in the forefront in the past, or is it different this time?
Well, I'm a little skeptical. I mean, youth may seem to be at the forefront. I mean, again, my skepticism, having observed Nepali politics for a while, is that there's often elite networks behind youth. I mean, I talked briefly in the presentation about the role of student wings, but I don't think many people in Nepal would believe those student wings are acting spontaneously or from a grassroots perspective. They're being manipulated and controlled by often very elderly men with power and privilege, right? And even the Gen Z protests showed signs of that after a few days, after the initial spontaneous uprisings. So that's something I want to investigate myself. But yeah, that's where you get these conspiracy theories coming in, and the idea that, the youth are really just pawns of elite actors who are, shuffling positions and not necessarily changing the systems, which kind of speaks to the other question I got, which was from Sandeep, which was about
Sandeep. That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Whether people were rejecting particular parties or a system. I would say definitely a system based on interviews I did prior to the Gen Z protests with a lot of people in rural Nepal. It's definitely this what I call collusive competition system, in which it really doesn't seem to matter which party is in control. There's always a kind of rotation of rewards and posts between the parties. And that could lead to a problem later on, right? Because if the current government, even though it has an overall majority, the RSP ends up simply adopting that same system, then there will be terrible disillusionment, just as we had after the Maoist revolution. So one hopes that doesn't happen.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking up Sandeep's question as well. Moving on, there is a question by Mr. Moin Qureshi. How the subnationalism aspects deal with the Gen Z-led protests. So is there a kind of undercurrent of subnationalism running through these protests? If we could have a quick response to that. And then the specific question of, is there any particular is there any particular observation after election? So would you like to say something about, the outcomes of the election in the light of the Gen Z-led protests? So this is, if we could deal with these two questions, that'll be helpful. And then we move on to the next one. Sumati, would you like to set the ball rolling?
Can you repeat? Sorry, I was reading
the subnational nationalism aspect. That is one question. And the other is anything you would like to say about the post-election, any observations you would like to make about the post-election outcomes?
Well, I do not know what is meant by subnationalism.
Subnationalism, I guess, in the context of Sri Lanka, would be about regional aspirations, I guess,
so some of it allayed the fears of the Muslim people to some extent. Particularly the urban Muslims who were under, Muslims in the south who were under a lot of who were living under a shadow, in fear, and the ethnic kind of nationalist demands of the Tamils and the Muslims, they have not gone away. Because there have not been any structural, so this I include both Tamils and Muslims here. Those are still persistent, but there is a lot more goodwill now, I would say, among the communities, and even the Tamils have kind of, they voted for the current government in the general election in the north and all the kind of dyad. But the plantation Tamils, I don't know whether you know there's a community called the Tamils in the Hick country. They are continuing to fight for their betterment, whatever, So, I mean, these things have not gone away. They are going to persist for a very long time, and it's still difficult to know. And this government, although it has come on a kind of a promise of kind of inclusivity and all of that, it's still a very much Sinhala majority government. So we do not know what's going to happen yet.
Okay, we are now, time is slipping away and we are in this rapid fire mode. So I would welcome quick responses so that we can give an opportunity to all the people who have asked questions.
Okay, I mean, I'll just go quickly and talk about the post-elections a little bit, and to sort of say that it's a bit of both, right? And some of the aspirations of July, I think, just metered out, and some of it remained. There are two student leaders who made it to parliament through elections, but it kind of in this very few short days, some of the contradictions have become clear. So, for example, this idea of meritocracy, and because the protests emerged in the form of a quota reform movement, right? To say that meritocracy is better than patronage, right? But then meritocracy is also a very problematic term, right? And so we've seen one of the student leaders in the last few days sort of say that we shouldn't have a lottery-based system in admissions in schools. Instead, we should have admission tests, and they've actually changed that. And so that's one of these problematic things, right? So it has that cover of, okay, here's a Gen Z movement, but not exactly a progressive movement, right? But there are other aspects that might be more hopeful. So there's this July Charter, which has suggestions for constitutional reform that will make the Prime Minister more accountable, so to sort of disallow the kind of consolidation of power that we've seen. So if those reforms are actually implemented and worked through, there is a potential for hope in that realm. But there's a lot of contention also in terms of identity and what secularism is, what nationalism is, what democracy is, and so on, which are still pending.
Thank you. Richard, over to you.
Yeah, I'll speak to the electoral question because, the other question about subnationalisms and the role of the Madhya in Nepal is something I'm going to research this summer. But I mean, the most optimistic thing is simply the structural fact that the new government has an overall majority, which I believe is the first time that has happened in Nepali electoral politics since 1990, I think. And again, I mean, somewhat cynically, I mean, that means that private interests of the RSP, of the ruling party, now coincide to some extent with the public interests of the country, in that these systems of collusion and rotation and sort of backdoor deals, which have made people so disillusioned, will be less structurally likely, I guess, with a large overall majority. Other than that, we don't know. I mean, the government hasn't taken power yet. Many people are skeptical, and there is always reason to fear that the networks of privilege will reassemble themselves in new ways. But that simple fact of electoral mathematics is a positive thing, at least in the short term.
Thank you. So perhaps we could just take up one or two more questions. In fact, what I am reading now is one by Mr. Harendra Dasanaike. The speed of the protests culminating in regime change has accelerated from Sri Lanka, where it was 3 months of protest, to Bangladesh, 36 days of protest, to Nepal, just 2 days of protest. This means that institutions even had increasingly little time to respond and to make a compromise, not that they really did. How can we interpret this very fast conversion of protests? What does this tell us about institutions of democracy? A very large question and very limited time to respond. But so who would like to go first? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, I'll go first because there's, I think I have a short answer, which is that in the last 15 years, we've seen the decimation of political institutions throughout, right? And so this moment where institutions couldn't respond was not really new in a certain way, that people had already kind of begun to live in a situation where political institutions did not respond to people's needs. So there's that. And so a lot of the, if you sort of look at the second tier desires and, like going along with what Sumandi had said about issue specific demands, I think reform of political institutions was one of the top second tier demands that emerged, in line with democratic change. So in the Bangladeshi context, what does it mean to demand for a democratic change? What does it mean to say that we want democracy? And I think if we sort of break it down, part of it has been that we want responsive political institutions that are independent, separate from the state. And I think that demand, I think, became very clear in a way that I think had not been in the past in these kinds of mobilizations. And so, that question of, can they respond? I think what we've seen in the 18 months interim government period, where we expected a lot of change and reforms in political institutions, the fact that they were not really able to do that, again, speaks to the challenge that the person who asked the question raises about the inability and sort of sluggishness with which institutional change.
Sure. Okay. I think we are close to we have all the time that we had. I wish I could, I think, there are many takeaways, and it's hard to summarize what the takeaways are. But what I could say is that, there are many things we learned. For example, the fact that the Gen Z is, all these protests show them to be thoughtful, aware, caring, invested in the future. And I think this concern about dignity, which comes through. And of course, a very important point which Navina made about the branding of Gen Z, so that, they can relate to an international context. I think that is also very important. Of course, we all agree about the network, the infrastructure, social media, all of that. For me, the takeaways personally, of course, this is, of course, subjective in some ways. I'm a student of history. And of course, youth have always been at the forefront whenever any significant change has taken place. One can think about the Quit India movement of 1942. One can think about the 21st July 1952, language Martyrs' Day in Dhaka. One can think about the Jayaprakash Narayan-led movement, which brought just preceding the emergency, and which led to long-term change because it brought into power political parties who were invested in redistributive justice. So all these are examples. But I think what is important perhaps is to remember that youth are the carriers of hope in any society, in any context, in any age. And their ideas are important, and it's wonderful that this conference is deliberating upon their behavior, their preferences, their aspirations, because without that demography of youth, there cannot be hope which can be sustained in any society. So on that rather lofty note, I want to thank everyone for being there, to the participants for the very insightful, thoughtful presentations, to Rajini for bringing us together, and the ISAS team. And I have a request to Professor Iqbal Singh Sevia, Director of ISAS, that in the proceedings that are published of this conference, there should be a chapter devoted to memes, graffiti, and cartoons. Thank you. I think there may be housekeeping announcements which Tanuja would make, and look forward to seeing you in the panel that will follow soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the chair. We will now take a short break and resume at 11 a.m. for panel 2.
Thank you. Thank you.